Okie dokie, folks, and welcome back to Monday Night Shaw right here on the Backbreaker Media Network. My name is Kyle Shaw, a.k.a. The Canadian Goose, and joining me this week from Canadian Wrestling's Elite, it is a mainstay on the Winnipeg scene, a guy who's actually wrestled all over the world. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for Hot Shot Danny Duggan. How are you doing, Danny?
I'm doing great, and more importantly, someone who's wrestled all over the world, but most recently wrestled the Canadian Goose on 3 occasions. That's got to be listed in my list of accomplishments in my introductions moving forward.
Solid. Yeah, we actually just finished up this last weekend here. It was a tour of Alberta. You guys did Medicine Hat, Calgary, Red Deer, Grand Prairie, St. Albert. And you drafted me in for those last 3 shows to fill in for some folks who were injured. And then I ended up wrestling you, who turned out to be also injured. And then today you got your prognosis back. Why don't you break the bad news to everyone here on the podcast and just give us some indication of what the future looks like for you?
Well, just to backtrack a little bit, this injury started on the first tour back in Alberta in the month of July. I was wrestling Mentolo, and it was in Red Deer, of all places, and it was kind of a freak accident. He picked me up for a tombstone pile driver, and my foot got caught in the mat, but my body kept cartwheeling up as he put me upside down for the tombstone, and there was a loud pop in my knee. I knew something was instantly wrong. I thought I'd be looking down and seeing my kneecap on the other side of my leg by the way it sounded and the way it felt. Luckily, that wasn't the case. And I continued to wrestle for the remainder of the week with my knee heavily taped up and bandaged because I couldn't put a lot of pressure on it. Little did I know it could be much worse than that, as I found out this week. So I continued to wrestle on that knee. We did a tour of Saskatchewan. I think I did 5 matches over the span of a weekend the following week for the CWE TV tapings and iPPV. And all things indicated that there was some wear and tear, but it was going to be okay as long as I protected it and I made sure to avoid certain movements. So rolling into Alberta last week, we did our first show of the 5 last week in Medicine Hat. And I was wrestling our good friend, Steven Styles. And it was the first time in a month that I didn't tape the knee up because it was feeling pretty good. Like I was walking around without any discomfort. There was no weakness. I had done squats on 2 occasions in the previous week with no discomfort or pain. So I figured everything had healed up and everything was okay. I did a simple standard back elbow of all moves. I shot Steven Styles off the ropes. I stepped in to hit him with a back elbow, and that lateral movement popped my kneecap right out again. This time it was a louder pop, so much that Steven heard it on the mat from across the ring, and followed by it kind of crumbling to the side. It gave like a little shake, and my knee completely gave out on me. So I knew something was instantly wrong. I assumed that I just kind of re-aggravated the injury from the previous month. But I soon learned within about a half hour it was probably much worse as it was starting to swell about twice the size of my other leg. I was offered, a walking cane for assistance. That wasn't enough. I literally could not put a single pound on my foot. So I was like holding myself up on the wall, trying to use the counter to get up. And I had to physically be carried from the building by 2 of the boys in the locker room. So went to the hospital in Medicine Hat that night, and within an hour, that leg was ballooned right up. It was starting to show some discolorment, and they did an x-ray on it, and they ruled out it being the kneecap or any bones. So that was a plus. But unfortunately, they weren't able to do an MRI because the swelling was too great.
Oh.
So they said, stay off of the leg, which I didn't. Stay off of that leg. And when you get back home to Manitoba, go for an MRI and get it checked out. So, assuming it was in the same atmosphere as the injury the previous month, I continued to tape it up and just adjusted my matches accordingly and how I approached them. But I can definitely tell it was much worse than it was before. But it was tolerable. So I continued to wrestle the week, including matches with yourself. And afterwards, after each match, there was a lot of discomfort because just stepping on the leg in the condition it was in, not knowing what was wrong with it was, probably causing more damage than I knew. So went to the hospital upon return, and it turns out I tore my quadricep, and that's why I can't walk on my leg this time or put any pressure on it where previously I was able to. So The hospital did their assessment. They said I've tore the quad. Luckily, it didn't come off the bone like you had seen. I know most famously with Triple H when he tore his quad in his match. His came right off the bone and rolled up his leg. Luckily, mine is not at that level of severity, but it is a tear nonetheless. So unfortunately, the swelling is still too great. So it has been under a week, so they can't do an MRI to see the full level of the swelling. So I got to give it a couple days and then go see a specialist, and they're going to get a deeper look in there to see how big of a tear we're looking at. But we're looking at anywhere from 2 to 6 months recovery time, based on the level of tear and based on my recovery and my I guess intelligence level in regards to staying off of it, not pushing myself too hard, which is probably going to be lacking. I can tell you that right now. I'm supposed to be out for Real Canadian Wrestling this weekend. I plan on making those events. That may change over the next 48 hours, but I plan on making those events. We're out in Saskatchewan for 4 events on CWE's Cruel Summer Tour next week. And, as an independent professional wrestler, if you don't work, you don't get paid. So I don't like the idea of staying off my leg, but I also don't like the idea of further injuring my leg. So it's going to be a little bit of a balancing act over the next little while we assess the damage here and try to move forward.
Yeah, I feel you for sure. I mean, I've had to take a couple of matches off in the past due to injuries and stuff, and it's always a huge bummer,
It definitely is, and sometimes as wrestlers we like to think we're supermen. That seems to be a mentality that's kind of come and gone to a detriment, where guys take matches off for just little bumps and bruises now. I remember I was in a car accident a couple of years ago where I nearly lost my life, but I lost my ability to walk straight for about a month or so because my back was blown out. And I remember it was like 3 days after the match, or maybe 3 days, just under a week from that match, we had another event in Winnipeg, which I participated in physically, but very, minimal movement. And there was a wrestler that hadn't wrestled in about a month that was booked on the event that showed up and told me he couldn't compete that night because he had a quote unquote sore back. And I'm thinking, dude, I literally almost died in a car accident last week and I'm here wrestling. Like, give me a break. So there's definitely both spectrums where some guys kind of take advantage of, oh, well, it's best to be safe. And then there's guys that kind of broke in there mostly for my, time in the business. I'm kind of the end of that generation where we were very much taught in training where, if you're not willing to work hurt or you don't have the ability to work hurt, chances are you're never going to work because, if you're going to do this at a high level and if you're going to do this at a full-time level and try to keep a full schedule, chances are you're going to be working hurt almost all the time. It just comes with the nature of the job. And that's not to say that we're tougher than anybody else or that we deserve a gold star for that. That's just the nature of the business. We're in a very physical business, and on any given night, you're getting the crap beat out of you, to pretty extensive levels, and you got to get in the car and you got to keep on doing it. So it's very common that we're wrestling with some kind of injury or some kind of pain or unresolved issue from one night to the next. Unfortunately, there's situations like this that are a little more extreme that you probably should take time off for, but I'm still very much set in that way. There was a CWE documentary that aired across the country on CBC a couple of years back that's now available on Amazon Prime. And that was, a time of they caught on tour. Just before that started, I tore my pec and bicep, and I had to wrestle for 3 weeks on a nightly basis with my arm and chest, dangling from the bone, give or take. So it's not something that's foreign to me. It's probably something that I'm going to pay for in the future, but I'm very much of that mentality of, tape it up, kid. If you can get to the ring, we can make the match work. And that's something I try to instill on, the wrestlers today, because a lot of times they think, if they're a little beat up, that they have to take the night off. And sometimes you do. I'm not saying it's for everybody to get in the ring and wrestle completely fucking destroyed. But at the same time, it does come with the business. And I find every time I have been hurt, especially when it's been the serious injuries, such as, the leg over the last week, or when I tore my pec and bicep, I've actually come out a better wrestler for it, because when you get in the ring and you have such a physical limitation on yourself where you can't, use a certain part of your body, or you have no strength in a certain part of your body, you have to think outside the box, because now you have to protect yourself and keep your body safe, but you also have to give the people a good match. So yeah. You learn ways to work around your injury, and you learn to compensate in other areas to make those matches entertaining, or you learn different variations of storytelling or selling that can be effective, that make your match stand out from the other matches on the card. So that's like another reason I really try to push myself to wrestle when I'm hurt, and tell guys, unless it's something really serious and you're just a little beat up, just communicate that with the booker, communicate that with the other wrestlers, and go up there and challenge yourself. If you got a bad back, you don't necessarily want to be taking superplexes off the top rope, but there's other ways you can have a good match that don't include doing that or taking big bumps, where you can still entertain the people, still have your match, still make your money, and still make it to the next town in one piece.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I'm definitely like I've never had to wrestle with a torn quadricep or anything like that. I wrestled with a broken ankle once. I didn't know it was broken. Yeah, I was wrestling. I wrestled metal in a match in Gibbons, and I broke my ankle during the match. I did a swanton bomb, and just the way I came down, I broke my ankle. And immediately I was like, "Oh, that really hurt," and that sucked. But we just finished what we were doing, right? Like you get adrenaline when you're out there. And then the next day I couldn't walk, and we showed up at the show, and I was limping, and Squig says, "What's wrong with you?" I was like, "I think I might have sprained my ankle or something." And he's like, "Okay, well, you're in a tag match tonight with me and my son, and it's you and Bruce the midget, and we're gonna have a tag team match." I'm like, "Oh, okay, all right. I'm having a very big difficulty here, but if we, arrange things in a certain manner that we can kind of hide that from people." Let's go for it. And so we did. And then when I got back to Edmonton or whatever, I went to the doctors, and they were like, "Yeah, you have a broken ankle." And I was like, "Oh, that might not have been smart for me to wrestle."
Yeah, for better or for worse, usually when you get hurt in a match, unfortunately the second time when I hurt my knee, it was immediate. I knew something was wrong, and we wrapped it up within about a minute or two. But more, I've had that happen, what you're discussing, where you break your ankle. Well, not me specifically breaking my ankle, but have injuries like that where something's wrong, but you have that adrenaline going, which gets you through. And usually when you pop something in the body or strain something in the body, it doesn't swell to the point of not being able to be used immediately. You've got a short window while your body's still, absorbing the injury and starting to swell up and starting to realize what's wrong with it. So if it happens in the middle of a match, you do have a small window given, depending on the injury, to kind of get through it before you realize how bad it is. I've had injuries where right away something's wrong, but there's some where you kind of bang something or you feel a pull or a little tear, and you're like, "Oh, that's not good," and you finish things up, and it's not until the next morning you realize how bad it really is, and how lucky you were to be able to kind of finish that up. But like you said, you had a bad ankle, and it's funny you say a tag team match, because that's what I was talking to the promoter about for this weekend. I said, I probably can't give you a 20-minute main event. If you put me in that position, I'll definitely go up there and try. But in terms of, keeping the people's best interest in mind and the tickets they're paying for, if you put me in a tag match with anybody who's capable of not only protecting me, but knows what they're doing inside the ring, I'll give you a great 20-minute tag team main event. And you probably won't even realize I'm hurt. Because I'm confident enough in my ability and my storytelling ability that I will be able to still bring you on a ride where you're still enjoying the match you're seeing, even though I'm physically maybe not capable of doing some of the things I am at 100%. And I think that's important too. And it kind of goes back to learning how to tell different stories and being able to kind of adapt to your different environments. I'm not a wrestler. I never have been a wrestler that has gotten over based on, athletic feats or high risk maneuvers or things of that nature. I've always been a wrestler that's gotten over with my storytelling, my ability to sell, my psychology, and things of that nature. So as long as my brain is still working, which is questionable on the best of days, I can still give you a good pro wrestling match and tell you a good story, and you probably won't notice too much of a difference because I'm not somebody that is delegated to having to do dives to the floor, come off the top rope, or do these crazy feats of athleticism in order to entertain an audience. So luckily I physically can't do a lot of those things, but mentally don't need to, thank God. And that comes real handy when you're working hurt and having to work around certain roadblocks.
Yeah, 100%. That all makes sense to me. It was definitely a learning experience for me this last weekend, wrestling with someone that has such a severe injury. I mean, I don't think I've ever been in the ring with anyone that's dealing with anything quite that cumbersome.
And you did a great job, and that's why we ended up wrestling on night 1, and that's why we ended up wrestling on night 2 and 3, which wasn't originally planned, because you were someone who was able to adapt to those elements, and that's what makes a great pro wrestler and makes a great quote unquote worker, if you're talking inside terms, because that's the work of professional wrestling, is being able to work with your elements and still captivate an audience. And once again, I might be speaking out of turn here, because quite honestly, I don't think I've seen you wrestle prior to wrestling you these last few days. So I would say, just based on my experience with you, you're not someone either who connects with an audience based on your ability to do something flashy off the top rope. You're somebody who has the ability to connect with the audience due to having a very colorful personality, a fun gimmick, and just the ability to connect with the audience. And when you can do that the way you did, I still had a match with you that, hurt or not hurt, probably wouldn't have changed much differently. If I was capable of wrestling at 100% with 2 good legs and a fully functioning body, that match we had over the last 3 days is probably quite similar to the same match I would have had 100% healthy, because it was a good wrestling match that told a good story, that had personalities and characters that conflicted with each other, that connected with the audience, that they were able to understand. And that's pro wrestling. So you did a great job in terms of not only being able to protect me because you're qualified to do so inside the ring, but you were also able to protect the integrity of the business, because you had a personality and the ability to tell a story that wasn't dependent on a lot of physical wear and tear on our bodies. And that's pro wrestling. And you go back and listen to the old veterans talking about wrestling 300 plus days a year and all that kind of stuff. That's how they did it. They weren't going out there and physically destroying each other to full capacity on every given night. They were still working very hard, and they were still being very physical, but it was done in a realm that allowed them to get to the next town and the next town and the next town, all while still providing an entertaining experience for the ticket buying audience. And that's the magic of pro wrestling.
Yeah. I mean, 100%. Like, I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and like lie to you or anything. I do like to do like some flashy stuff once in a blue moon, but like I like to kind of keep it like sparse, right? So that if I do something flashy, it's kind of like, oh wow, I didn't expect to see that out of that guy,
And there's a time and place for everything.
100%. Like, yeah, there is.
And when I say that, I don't suggest that either you or myself, literally do nothing, or do the whole, hey brother, we're gonna go up there and do nothing and sit on a hold. It's nothing like that.
Yeah,
we're still working. We're still working very hard, and we're still being very physical. We're just being very conscious of the risks and bumps we take overall. So we're not taking a bigger risk than that's needed for that audience, where we can't then perform for the next one. And that's what's really important. Like, there's so many guys, and it's like, I wish I could name names, but you can't name names of a lot of these guys because they fade away so quick. There's a lot of really talented athletic guys that have come and gone over the last 20 years, where you see them, you're just blown away by their athleticism, and you're like, wow, this guy can really do some cool stuff. And you're sitting in the locker room like, hell, I can't do a fraction of what that guy does. But you give it a year or two, and that guy's either not around anymore, or he's sitting on the shelf with an injury, because there's a lot of guys who do have some really great athleticism and some tremendous athletic feats, but sometimes it becomes a crutch, where they go, well, if I come off the top rope with that really cool move, I know I'm going to get this chant, or I'm going to get this reaction. So instead of kind of polishing and rounding out their game where they're capable at all aspects of it, a lot of guys will become very dependent and kind of use it as a crutch, because they know it's an easy go-to, where if they do this crazy feat, or if they do this really athletic move, they're going to get a response. And it's the same thing as it's kind of the opposite of cheap heat. You hear cheap heat of heels kind of just going out there saying, hey, shut up, fat boy, and kind of using all the cheap go-to, this town sucks. It's kind of the babyface equivalent, where it's like, well, if I do a really cool dive or a really cool move off the top rope, I know I'm going to get a response. It's kind of a cheap pop. You're going to get it, because it is kind of visually impressive to see. But over time, once they've seen it a time or two or three or four, you'll notice that pop starting to diminish, and then the audience is kind of like, well, what else you got? And that's where it becomes key and essential to be a well-rounded performer. So you can still do your cool move and still connect with your audience that way, but you have the mental capacity and ability to place it in different spots and tell different stories with it. So when you do get it, it's not like, oh, well, he's just hitting that cool move again. It was placed in the story in a different fashion, and people are anticipating it instead of expecting it.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with everything you say there. I mean, it's interesting talking to you and stuff because, like, you have been around for quite a long time. When did you first debut as a wrestler, Danny?
My debut match was on January 2003. So we're going on 19 years this upcoming January. I was very lucky to get involved in the business as a young teenager, helping out at local shows, ringing the bell, carrying ring jackets to the back. I started refereeing at 14 years old. I got involved very young. And then when while I was refereeing and helping out, I was training before the events with a lot of the local talent. So I got the opportunity when somebody didn't show up on a night to then step in the ring and fill in. And that kind of was the start of my wrestling journey, where it was full-time wrestling after that. So I've been at it for, close to 19 years now. For better or worse, I started, at the age of 15, which gave me an incredible mental advantage because by the time I was 18 years old, I had already traveled and wrestled across half the United States, most of Canada, and was getting a lot of cool opportunities that really pushed my development to the forefront. Because by the time I was 18, 19 years old, I was really polished, having worked with a lot of, I shouldn't say very polished, but I was definitely more polished than the average 18-year-old that was breaking into wrestling school by getting those opportunities to kind of get on the road early and work with guys. So by the time I was in my early 20s, I've been wrestling, 6, 7, 8, 9 years, which really, really helped in terms of, getting opportunity and being able to capitalize on opportunity at a young age. But then there's also the downfall. We're talking about, being beat up, after 19 years. You start taking bumps at 14, 15 years old when your spine's still developing. There's going to be some wear and tear there that you're going to pay for down the line that I'm now realizing at this point in my life, but I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Yeah, and like sometimes when you're young and you're feeling real healthy, you do tend to be a little bit more reckless with the things that you'll do out there, eh?
Oh, 100%. And it's so funny because it becomes such a cliche. Like, I remember it's a cliche for every old veteran in the locker room to be like, you're doing too much, kid. Slow down. Less is more. And as a young guy, you're always just like, yeah, whatever. You're just being old and lazy. You just don't want us going out there and working too hard, so you have to work harder. But it's really true. Like, when you're young, you're kind of taking a lot of needless and senseless bumps that you probably don't have to. But I think it's a part of the learning process. Like, because you do realize over time, what you need to do and what you have to do in order to captivate the audience for the same reaction, if not a bigger one. So a lot of times when you're younger, I think that is a part of the process of learning and maturing as a wrestler, because you do a lot more than you need to. If I went back and watched matches from my first 5 years, I'd probably be laughing at myself and calling myself a mark for all the bumps I was taking and all the risks I was taking. But it was a part of the learning process, because you kind of learn, okay, well, if I save these for these shows or these kind of matches or this story, it's going to be more effective than just doing them because. But there's also something to be said for, you're being when you're a young guy, you're trying to get on the radar, you're trying to get people to notice, your effort. So you are working a little bit harder and maybe, taking some bigger bumps than you need to and things of that nature. But it is a piece of advice that, you kind of laugh, because it's like usually the go-to advice, especially from guys who don't know what the fuck they're talking about. They've just heard it enough time and it sounds good. So they usually just kind of use it as the go-to advice to young guys in the locker room without really knowing what it means. But there's definitely a truth to that, like less is more and slowing down. But a lot of times it's interpreted as like, slow down, you're doing too much, as in they think they mean, slow down and sit on a hold for 5 minutes, brother. We're gonna get some good heat. Like, that's not what slowing down means. It means a million different things, but that's not what's being referenced when that's being talked about. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I kind of broke in at an interesting time. Like, I started in January 2003. Ring of Honor started in 2002. TNA started in 2002, and the X Division was kind of like their big draw. So when I was breaking into the business, like, I'm a 15, 16-year-old kid, and I'm getting all these cool indie tapes of like guys my age or just slightly older, and around the same size, just young kids doing all these crazy athletic things and doing all these big head drops and kicking each other really stiff and doing all this stuff that was kind of captivating the indies at the time, because it really hadn't been seen on a bigger scale yet. So when I broke in, Ring of Honor and X Division and, Japanese wrestling was becoming a little more prevalent here with the tape traders and on the internet and stuff like that. So there definitely was a lot of doing things that were completely unnecessary that you look back on going, why in the world did I beat my body up like that? Because, you were just like, young kid in the business, and that was like the cool, flavor of the month at the time was doing, the Japanese strong style and doing these cool high spots. And, guys like Low Key were beating the crap out of each other. And then you had, the Amazing Red doing all these crazy athletic feats and things that nobody saw.
I definitely can relate to that because I remember I was kind of a fan of TNA like once because I back then I didn't think there was anything except for like WWE and WCW and ECW, and then WCW and ECW kind of closed down, and I was like, oh, the only wrestling is WWE. And then one day I just stumbled upon TNA and was like, I was watching, it's like, oh, well, that's it. Holy cow, look how fast and hardcore they're going. This is amazing. And so then I'd start having buddies over and we'd start watching those pay-per-views pretty regularly. And then, boys being boys, a lot of it turned into like going out in the backyard afterwards, But
Totally.
yeah, like that TNA Ring of Honor stuff, that's some of my favorite stuff for sure. But like,
and that's why too, because like you mentioned, like you only knew WB at the time, and so did a lot of people. So when that stuff kind of popped up, whether the psychology was on point or if it was believable or not, it was just so different. And because it was, so athletic and so fast, and these bumps were so crazy, like especially as an impressionable teenager or a young kid, you're like, wow, this is the coolest thing ever. That's kind of what ECW was built on in the 90s. It was, for better or worse. It existed, depending on who you talk to, but it was so different than the corporate wrestling people were familiar with that you couldn't help but take notice, especially if you're a wrestling fan or if you're a young guy. You're like, this is the coolest thing ever because I like wrestling, but they're doing wrestling differently. I've never seen it like this before. So it kind of captivates your imagination, and then you start to get into wrestling with it. You're like, well, I want to do what all the cool guys are doing, and you try to emulate what you're seeing, these guys doing it, not realizing they probably don't know what they're doing yet because they're still young and figuring it out. But then eventually you get to a point where, you wrestle enough and you've been in front of enough audiences and you work with enough guys that do know what you're doing. You're going, oh, okay, well, maybe it doesn't make sense to do it like that, but I can take elements of it and I can place it correctly. And if I tell the right story with it, I can still do it, but I can make it more effective instead of just going out there and trying to cram all these moves in at a mile a minute because they were really cool and I saw them on a wrestling tape.
Yeah. I 100%. And then like the evolution there, like as far as like my own personal fan and was like I really liked all the Ring of Honor and TNA stuff, and then I sort of got into the like. Have you ever watched Chikara wrestling?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so I got really into Chikara wrestling, which is like a lot of really like crazy athletic matches with like wild lucha spots and stuff, but it's also like over the top characters. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what started to appeal to me about Chikara wrestling was just like the over the top, like crazy characters I would see there and stuff. So like when I thought about what I was going to do, a lot of that came from Chikara and just like have a fun character that people can get behind,
That's really fun you say that because like that just goes to show like every pro wrestling really can be for everybody. Like even on a independent circuit, there's always going to be fans of something. Like every style of wrestling is going to kind of captivate people's imagination differently. Chikara kind of had the opposite effect on me in the sense that I grew up on 80s WWF. And then, so like I still to this day love 80s WWF and WWF from the 90s and started to watch WCW. So like I very much grew up on traditional pro wrestling, or at least on a national stage, traditional pro wrestling, to what was being presented to the masses, and then I saw the cool stuff like Ring of Honor and TNA. I was like, wow, this is really cool and captivating. It's different. But then as I started to kind of go down the independent wrestling rabbit hole more and came across things like Chikara, I thought it was so silly because I was like, this is way over the top. I was like, this isn't realistic at all. So it kind of like turned me back the other direction where I was like, maybe I like my wrestling a little more realistic and story based and more convincing in terms of the characters and the wrestlers that are portraying them. So like I would enjoy it, as like a standalone show to watch, but in terms of like my overall enjoyment for pro wrestling and what I liked watching and what I liked presenting, it kind of did the opposite effect to me. I was like, maybe we're getting a little too crazy with this stuff, where we're kind of maybe exposing the business a little too much, or we're kind of being a little too tongue-in-cheek and letting people in a little too much, where they're kind of clearly seeing it silly. It's like, I was always, even when I liked, the faster paced independent stuff growing up, I always kind of believed like wrestling still had to be presented in a way that was, credible, as credible as pro wrestling can be. It can be as credible as you want it to be with your believability in your work, but there's certain elements of it that instantly say, hey, wrestling's kind of bullshit. But you can still kind of hide those in a way and disguise them in a way that's still presentable and in the realm of reality. So, watching some of that stuff, like, was the opposite to me, where I was like, maybe I'm being a little too ambitious with this stuff. Maybe it's a little too unbelievable to be doing these kind of moves that require this kind of cooperation, or maybe we're running a little too much ha-ha in these spots that kind of say we're working together instead of trying to beat each other up.
Yeah, so wrestling in slow motion, or somebody like throws a grenade or something. Yeah, like I've seen stuff like that. I'm like,
so it's interesting you say that, because like, it had that effect on you, and then it would have a different effect on me. Like, I can still enjoy it for what it is and enjoy it at the time, but in terms of like what I invest my time in and wanted to watch regularly, I wanted something a little bit different, and I would go on that path. So that's this conversation is a prime example of there's a little of something for everybody in pro wrestling. And even as much as to this day I have my beliefs on what wrestling should be and what I like it to be, you have to be very mindful, especially if you're a wrestling promoter, wrestling booker, but definitely as a wrestler as well, because you're in front of that audience, portraying this stuff.
Yeah, and
you have to be open-minded to people enjoy different things for different reasons, and I try to be mindful of that, especially when booking a card. That I could book a 2 to 3 hour card with what I like, and I could be and generally speaking, most people will probably enjoy it too. But if I just book strictly what I like, I'm leaving out some stuff I don't like, which other people may like. Therefore, they're not getting the full experience as well. So, even though I have my strong beliefs and traditions in pro wrestling, I still try to be mindful. There is a young Kyle Shaw in the audience watching that goes, maybe I don't really like this old school style stuff, but these young guys kind of with these crazy Canadian goose gimmick, he's kind of fun. And, so there's a place for him too. It doesn't have to necessarily be, an entire crew of wrestlers that are, 6 feet plus, 220 pounds, muscled up, big guys. There's a room for the Canadian Goose on the show, and for him to fit in with the pack and not be a detriment to the show, but be a benefit because he's unique and different than everybody else. So that's kind of the lesson I've taken from all this over the years in wrestling, is you got to try to have a little bit of something for everybody, and this conversation really kind of solidifies that.
Yeah, they're definitely like one of the things I happen to notice about like WWE, at least a few years back. It's not quite as bad anymore, but like variety is kind of the spice of life, right? So there was a time when it was a lot of guys that were like, you had like Chris Masters, and there was just a lot of like cookie cutter, just muscled up guys that were out there being good wrestlers. And now you got some small dudes that do all kinds of crazy stuff. You got some big dudes, you got some fat dudes. Like, I think variety really brings a lot of interestingness to the wrestling. You know what I mean?
Totally. And like I've heard the term used before, like some of these niche indies, they'll produce what's called kind of like a one-note wrestling show, where it's kind of the same style and same presentation the entire time through. And that's something, like, I've been on shows like that, and it's something I try to avoid presenting myself, just for the matter of, if I've seen this in match 1, why do I need to watch it again, matches 2 through 6, or however many matches are on the card that night? I want each match to be a little bit different, either in terms of the style of wrestling, or the characters or personalities, or the conflict that's being told. If every match is the same, there's no reason to continue watching after you watch that first match. You want everything to offer something a little bit different. So, not only are you continuously being entertained by something new, but it flows, and you don't get into that rut of, I've seen this already. And it's funny you mentioned, that era of wrestling, because I remember because I broke in that around that time, and that was when, the OVW experiment was very, very influential on the OVW developmental program was very influential on WWE's television and how they brought talent in. And there very much was like kind of like a memo at the time of like, you need to be 6 feet tall, over 220 pounds, and everybody was in trunks and boots. And I'm not judging that, as I'm someone who wears trunks and boots, is over 6 feet tall and over 220 pounds, and that's a look I portray. But when everybody looks like that, then none of us are special. So I'm very big on everybody needs to kind of stand out and look different and bring something different to the table than the next guy. For that very reason, like I remember, because I was in the business at that time in the 2000s, and just being in the business, and when you're a wrestler, people talk to you about wrestling that are outside the business, and I can't tell you the amount of times in the mid 2000s or late 2000s I'd be having a conversation with somebody about wrestling who maybe didn't watch all that much or just tuned in a couple times, and them trying to describe the wrestler to me that they were talking about was near impossible, because they'd be like, oh, it was the guy, kind of had a short haircut, spiky hair, he had boots, black trunks. I think he had some tattoos, maybe. Like you couldn't differentiate who he was talking about, and I'd be like, oh, is it this guy? No. Yeah. Is it this guy? No. And I'd run through 4 or 5, like these kind of conversations that happen all the time, where I'm trying to figure out who he's talking about as somebody who's currently watching the product on a regular basis, thinking I'm understanding who he's describing. But there were so many guys that were so similar, it would take 4 or 5 guesses before it'd be like, oh yeah, that guy. I think it was that guy. Where if you watch wrestling in the 80s or 90s, like the Attitude Era, you had a porn star, you had a vampire, you had the Degenerates, you had Team Canada, you had the Undertaker, you had every character was very descriptive and identifiable to themselves. I'm sure there's some exceptions, obviously, but you had the Nation of Domination, you had the Black Street Gang, you had the Biker Street Gang, you had Kai and Tai, the Japanese gang. Like you had it was very easy to, in a matter of a few words, to be like, oh, I saw so and so, and anybody who is familiar with the product even slightly be like, oh, he must be talking about this guy. And that's very important, not only from a marketing standpoint to grow your business, but just from connecting with your audience. Like your audience should be able to decipher who you are, within a few words of describing you. Like I'm certain if somebody were to describe the Canadian Goose, they'd be like, hey, I was at a show, there's this guy that was doing this honking. That'd be the first thing they say. There's a guy doing this honking. And everybody right away would be like, the Canadian Goose. And that's why your character works and why it connects with an audience, because it's simple and it's something that people can, describe and get behind and understand very, very quickly. Where there's a lot of people, they can't do that. Like you can't be like, oh, he looks like this, or he appears like this, or he does this trait. And if you're not able to do that for somebody in a relative quick basis, then you've underthought. You either underthought your perception to the audience, or you haven't placed enough importance on being distinctive and different than everybody else, because you should be able to do that. Everybody should have their own honk. I'm not saying physically in terms of a chant, but everybody should have their own honk in the sense the Canadian Goose does, where people go, hey, the guy that honks, the Canadian Goose. Mm-hmm. They know right away. Everybody should have at least one trait of them that's distinctive like that separates them from everybody else, whether it be the way they walk, the way they talk, whether it be a move they do, if there's somebody that relies on that, or just the way they dressed, or a distinctive personality or gimmick trait. Like everybody should be able to be described fairly quickly by, somebody new to wrestling who's kind of on the outside watching for the first time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me, 100%. Like, when I was kind of coming up with all this, it was like, okay, well, what can I do that's going to be completely different and make me like stand out, Because it's probably not going to be my impressive athletic maneuvers. So let's try to do something else with it,
And 100%. Like for a year, for a long time, I was the guy that was leading the charge and bringing Zubaz pants back, and I had a good 10-year run where that was very distinctive, a part of my gimmick, because I started to do a throwback wrestling character, throwback to the 80s and 90s, because everyone had become so progressive that old school wasn't cool anymore. I wanted to keep the tradition and history of professional wrestling alive. And, Zubaz pants are a big part of, that 80s, 90s wrestling culture. So, kind of as a rib, I got myself a couple pair, kind of, it's kind of like a tongue in cheek, like, oh, this is what the fucking wrestlers back then wore, and they're fucking ridiculous looking pants. So I kind of got a pair just for fun to pop the boys. But nobody was wearing them at this point, in 2010 or 11. They were long gone from wrestling fashion and pop culture. But I realized very quickly the reason they stuck and become a part of my gimmick for 10 years was the first time I wore a bright pink pair of, so there's a bright pink and black pair of Zubaz. I wore them out to the mall. And I wore them out with my mother. And we went to a very busy mall in Winnipeg. And literally every single person we passed stopped and stared or whispered to their friend, like, what in the heck is he wearing? Do you see those things?
Yeah.
And instantly right away, I was like, oh, this catches people's eye. And that very quickly became a part of my character and gimmick because it was something that stood out that people instantly recognized. Same thing with the fanny pack I did that right alongside with the Zubaz, doing the throwback gimmick because I got it, kind of as irony and kind of like, oh, it's funny, the wrestlers wore the fanny packs, and fanny packs aren't cool in 2012 anymore. And nobody was wearing them outside of like the really old school brothers that were still hanging around the business.
Yeah.
But you weren't seeing them in pop culture the way you do now. You weren't seeing them, they weren't a trendy fashion piece the way they are now in some circles. It was like, oh, that guy's wearing a fanny pack. It was very much that, and it was very much the same thing. I put that on, and instantly you see people kind of looking, going, oh, is he wearing that? What is he wearing? And then, you commit to it, and I start wearing it out in public. I start wearing it out to the bar. I start wearing it out to the restaurant. And the amount of conversations it started was, probably nearly the conversation started for almost every conversation I had with a stranger. Because they'd be like, you're wearing that thing? Or most commonly be, attractive girls at the bar would talk to you, and they'd be like, well, you're wearing that? Followed by, well, what's in it? What are you keeping in there? Why do you need to wear that? And it was such a mystery to them why anybody would be wearing this thing, but it caught people's attention and got them talking. So it was instantly like, okay, I'm going to, incorporate that too. And, so that became the thing. If you were describing Hotshot Danny Duggan on a wrestling show, if you'd never been before, you'd be like, oh, the guy wearing the fanny pack, or the guy with the Zubaz pants, or the funny pants. And, that's wrestling. You kind of want to find something unique to you that stands out, that makes you distinctive from everybody else, that you can kind of make your own. And that's, you talk about any famous wrestler of all time, you could probably pick any name in your head and start describing him in a couple words, and I should be able to figure it out very quickly because there'll be something about him, whether it be the colors he wore, the way he walked. Like, everybody knows the Vince McMahon walk. Mm-hmm. You could be like, hey man, do the Vince walk, and everybody would know exactly who it was because there's only one guy that walks like Vince McMahon. And that's wrestling, and that's what's kind of brings it all back together. Is you have these, you have the Canadian goose that honks, and then you've got this guy that does that, and then this guy does this, and this guy has that trait, and we all have different traits and attributes about us that are different. Therefore, every single match on the card, just based on appearance and based on character, should be different than any other match on the card. Just based on that alone, before the bell rings, every single match should be different because you've got two characters that should be like no other on the show, whether it be in terms of their personality, their presentation. It shouldn't just be guy in tights and boots, because then if you've seen it once again, why do I need to keep?
There's been a lot of guys where, at least I've noticed out here in Alberta, especially like when they're coming fresh out of the wrestling school or whatnot, it's like they come and they show up and their gimmick is that they're so and so, they have a cool last name, and their gimmick is that they're a good wrestler. And I just think like if your gimmick is you're a good wrestler, you're gonna have to be a really, really, really good wrestler. you know?
Yeah, you have to be the best, or you're if you're not the best, you're last, essentially. And that's a good point. Like, and I don't know where it cut me off here, so I don't know where the edit will go back in. But that's what makes wrestling unique. Like, if you're just guy with boot and trunks, that's fine. But then there can't be 5 other guys that are just boot and trunks. Because if I watch boot and trunks in match 1, and he's just a good wrestler, and then boot and trunks, who's just a good wrestler, comes out in match 2, I just saw that. But if Boots and Trunks comes out and has a good wrestling match in match 1, and then match 2, all of a sudden Stompin' Tom starts, and this freaking crazy lunatic comes out who's honking at the audience like a goose, I'm paying attention. I'm going, what in the What's this guy up to? And I'm now intrigued because I haven't seen it yet. And then when the goose is done, out comes match 3, and he's wearing something different, and he's walking a certain way. Now I'm paying attention. But if in match 3 another guy comes out honking like a goose, I probably don't care as much as I just did when I saw him for the first time. And the same thing goes just for that basic presentation. That's why, as my, throwback kind of character evolved, like I was, like I said, I broke into the business in the early 2000s. So I was very much in the underwear model developmental era of professional wrestling, where they wanted guys in boots, trunks, rock solid abs, baby oil, short hair. I broke into that, and it was my goal to wrestle for WWE at the time. So I very much had a very similar look, because I knew that's the look they were looking for, and I needed to be presented a certain way in order to get on their radar. But then as time evolved, I went from being, this clean cut guy in boot and trunks, going, okay, well, I'm going to do the '80s throwback gimmick. If you go back and watch good quality classic '80s wrestling, there's a lot of guys rocking some pretty solid chest hair. So we're going to grow that out a little bit different. A lot of guys have it because they're lazy and they just don't keep themselves well kept. I'm going to rock it and style it because it's, very much a part of that look and that era and that generation. So we're going to add that with the boots and trunks and the fanny pack and this and that, so it's very much, it's like, well, it's very kind of, distinctive and presented in a way that's unique to me and my presentation. But when you talk to, also, plus people said I'm starting to look like Arn Anderson, and he rocks some solid chest hair. So you got to, make that comparison a little more easy for them. But at the same time, like you mentioned, the wrestling school kids, I don't have an issue with somebody coming out of wrestling school and not knowing who they are. And that's something,
that makes sense for sure.
You don't want to have 10 guys coming out of wrestling school doing that. But like here in CWE, we run a wrestling school out of Winnipeg, and when guys come to us and they're ready to start wrestling, they usually have some kind of grand idea of who they want to be and who they think they are. And it's very rare we're going to go with that right off the top, unless we've seen some kind of sign of it in the training facility where we're like, well, he really grasped that. Because more times than not, when someone breaks into wrestling, especially their first probably 100 matches, maybe even more, they're more concerned about just trying not to fuck up their wrestling match. They're more worried about trying to remember their basics and fundamentals. They're just trying to remember the few spots they put together in the back. They're more worried about trying not to look silly in front of the audience, because there's that self-consciousness there the first time you're out in front of an audience in a pair of wrestling trunks. So when you put a character on top of that that's got some kind of levels to it and got some layers to it, that needs to be presented in a certain fashion in order to get over, in terms of the way the guy walks and the way he talks and just specific character traits. I find more times or not, you do them a disservice when you kind of saddle them with a very distinctive character or personality, because they're so worried about the fundamentals of pro wrestling, and they're so worried about making sure they don't look silly and they don't mess up any spots. They don't give a crap about that character being authentic to itself, and you often then lose that on the audience. You just have a guy playing dressed up like he's out for Halloween. You got a guy who's dressed up as Indiana Jones, but he's wrestling like he's Dean Malenko. So it's I always like, for the first year or two, especially when we get a young talent fresh out of wrestling school, it's like, what's your name? What's your real name, or what's a generic name you kind of want to go by? Get that out of them, and then I'm just sending them out there to wrestle. Like that's would be the exception to the rule. I'm just going to send them to the ring to wrestle, to get comfortable in their own skin, because it sounds silly, but the amount of people, they don't understand the anxiety that comes with wrestling in front of a large crowd for the first time or the first 100 times. Not only is it something you want to do probably your entire life, you train for it for a year, you probably have family and friends out there, you're nervous as heck. So you're just concerned about going out there and doing good and not looking silly. So I usually try to kind of lean into that a little bit and be like, just go out there and wrestle, do your thing. And I'll put them in there, more times or not, with a veteran that will carry them and lead them. So the entire match overall is presented in a way that's entertaining to the people while they learn. But they only have to worry about just wrestling. Because, once they start worrying about, like, okay, well, between each move, I got to stop and do this pose, or I gotta stop and strut this way because this is what this character wants. Then you're gonna start seeing them screw things up, and now they're kind of falling all over themselves, or they're not committing to the character itself, and now you're just kind of seeing cosplay wrestling. So I very much like, for that first year, I'm very big, especially with the schedule we keep. A good, year's usually enough. We're like, just go out there and get comfortable. Worry about all the spots that you called, because everyone does that now. Very few guys will go in the ring and just call it. And, even as much as I encourage them not to do so much of that when they start, a lot of guys will, because they're more comfortable that way. Just go out there and worry about remembering your spots. Remember to sell. Remember to, show some fire and emotion in your comeback. Just the basics that are essential to, the overall picture that you want to make sure they have solidified. And then once you realize they're getting a little comfortable and they're starting to, not worry about that so much, you can usually see it. You'll see a light bulb go off. You're like, okay, he's getting it now. You can usually tell when someone's, been in the business under a year, or they only had a certain amount of matches, because there's kind of like a reluctance to them with all their movements. They're a little like, there's a hesitance. It's like, Is this what I'm supposed to do? I think this is right. Oh shit, what's next? Shit, did I do that right? You can see that on their eyes. You can see that with the way they shuffle their feet. It's very apparent. So you got to let them get over that. And then once that light bulb goes off, you're like, oh, he's starting to get some confidence out there. He's getting it. Once he starts to get it, then you can be like, hey man, well, let's start putting you in some stories here.
Yeah, and I definitely didn't want to imply that I was trying to bury anyone that does come out of wrestling school and just uses their own name or whatever.
No, not at all. I just wanted to kind of talk the importance of that, because we're kind of talking about character development and presentation, and it just kind of got me thinking that that's what happens a lot of times is guys overthink, their development in that regard, and it is kind of a detriment to them. So I wanted to kind of cover that, just based on the flow of the conversation, and just because I think that is something that's just often dismissed. So it was good that you made that comment. So I knew what you meant. So you don't need to clarify to me. But but that's why I kind of wanted to touch on that, because that is something that's so common. Like you go out, you'll probably see it in Alberta a lot now, because there are so many wrestling schools popping up. Like, go and watch those students wrestle. You're going to be able to see it. You're going to be able to see that hesitance in the way they go to lock up. After they hit a comeback, and maybe their opponent doesn't get up so fast or as quick as they had hoped, and they don't know what to do next. You're going to see this deer in headlights look and this little feet shuffle of like, oh crap, what do I do now? Now, when you notice that, also look at and try to notice which ones have characters and which ones don't. The ones that do, chances are they're not acknowledging that character or personality anymore. They're now just focusing on, oh crap, I don't want to look silly, I don't want to screw up, what do I do? Yeah. And now they're just so and so playing said wrestling character, and that's where they disconnect with the audiences. So once they get kind of comfortable being a wrestler, first and foremost, you put that, then you can start. I usually, before I even put a character on them, it's then, okay, after you've now got comfortable wrestling, let's focus on an angle. Let's put you in your first story, so you can now learn how to progress that, week to week or month to month, because that's a completely different skill. It's very easy to go out there and have that basic wrestling match you're taught how to do, and here's step one, here's step two. But it's a different art now to be like, okay, well, I got to get people intrigued to come back and see me again, and see me wrestle this guy again. So then you kind of get them put in that. Once they start that's usually when you'll start to see what kind of personality they'll have, is now when they're having to kind of cut promos or do run-ins or get beaten down and show some sympathy, to get people to care to come on back. That's when you'll start to see kind of what somebody has in terms of their level of depth, in terms of their personality and character. And then usually by the time they're done that first or second program, it's like, okay, well, we kind of have an idea who you are now, just based on what you've shown us. Just based on your own ability to kind of cut a promo and fire back at somebody who's, accosted you for a couple weeks, or your ability to run in and fire up on somebody that's laid you out a few weeks in a row. They'll kind of start to show you that themselves, and then it kind of all comes together, opposed to the standard, like, okay, you're going to be Doink the Clown, you're going to be a garbage man, you're going to be this. You can usually let guys kind of figure it out for themselves without them even realize they're doing it.
That's all like really awesome and interesting stuff. We are kind of approaching the end of the podcast here, but I'm going to have to get you back for like a part two, because we've touched on your opinions in wrestling and some of your current injuries, and just we've talked about you as a wrestler, but you're also like the promoter for Canadians Wrestling Elite, which, I'd like to learn all about how that got formatted and your experiences promoting and stuff. So I'd love to have you back on. But for the time being, why don't you give the people your social media plugs? Where can folks follow you? Where are you going to be? Obviously, if you've already mentioned you're planning to come out here to wrestle next weekend and whatnot. So just give us some idea about your social media and where we can find you.
Yours truly personally can be found at Hotshot Danny Duggan on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Snapchat at Hotshot Danny D. For CWE, you can follow us at CWE Canada on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We also now have a weekly television show that airs here in Winnipeg every Friday night on Shaw Television. It's called CWE Adrenaline. It is then uploaded for the world to see the following Saturday at 2 p.m. Central Canadian Time. It's a 30-minute program. It's been kind of our go-to during the COVID months here in Manitoba, as we just, as of last week, had our restrictions dropped, which will allow an audience again. But we haven't been able to have one for over a year. So we kind of made the transition over to doing studio wrestling. That project is still ongoing, and you can watch a new episode every Saturday at 2 p.m. Central on the CWE YouTube channel. We also now do monthly internet pay-per-views, which is another shift we made during the inability to have a live audience. Our next one is August 28th when CWE presents Cruel Summer, which will be the first time we are in front of a live audience with over 1,000 people expected at the Lilac Resort for that pay-per-view broadcast. So check out the Facebook for that information. And then as well, we're back on tour. We're now going back to Alberta on a monthly basis, the province of Saskatchewan on a monthly basis. Once I'm done here, I'm going to be hopping on the computer and announcing our Manitoba return date for the first time in 9 months as well. So we're back at it. You can check out all of our social media channels and find tickets at CWEtickets.com.
Yeah, folks, definitely go and check out those shows. Odds are you will see Danny in the ring, even though he's got a torn quad, but he's out there to entertain. So is everyone else at CWE. I had a great time being a part of it this weekend. Hopefully I can come out and do some more stuff with you guys at some point. But Danny, thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week, and hopefully I'll get to see you again.
Yes, likewise, my man, and it hasn't been officially, done in a formal fashion yet. But I do want to thank you for filling in on short notice last week, and personally taking care of me with some great performances. And I know you not only won over myself, but you did win over, the locker room as well. They're a big fan of your work that you portrayed in front of the audience. They were a big fan of your attitude in the locker room. And we're very hopeful that it's not the last we see the Canadian Goose in CWE. In fact, we'd love if you started coming out with the carload and doing some CWE television as well in the future. So hopefully we can put that together.
Yeah, 100%. We'll talk about that off the podcast and whatnot, because that sounds very appealing to me.
You heard it here first, people. Stay tuned. You might hear the honk coming to Manitoba before you know it.
Okie dokie. Well, Danny, thank you so much again, and I will talk to you later.
Thanks a lot, Kyle.